Former Georgian President Mikheil Saakashvili is preparing to make a political comeback as Deputy Prime Minister to Ukraine. Saakashvili says President Volodymyr Zelensky has asked him to drive economic and political reforms in Ukraine. Parliament must now approve his candidacy. It would be Saakashvili's second stint in Ukrainian politics. He served as governor of the country's Odessa region in 2015, but quit after falling out with Ukraine's then leader, Petro Poroshenko. Saakashvili cited corruption amongst officials as his reason for stepping down. And in an exclusive interview, DW asked Mikheil Saakashvili how he plans to succeed where he had once failed.
Mr. Saakashvili, how did you get the offer to become a Deputy Prime Minister? Did it come from President Zelensky?
It came from President Zelensky, obviously, with whom I have very good contacts. It came from Prime Minister Mikheil, and with specific mandate to help to strengthen the government's capacity to do the reforms, because reforms is what Ukraine needs the most, especially in these hard times.
4 years ago, you resigned as a governor of Ukraine Odessa region. You made this decision because, in your view, it was impossible to fight corruption among officials. What makes you believe that it will be different this time?
Because Poroshenko was fifth and Zelensky is definitely against fifths, that's for sure. We can argue about different aspects of his policy, but I had no doubt about it that he has correct direction. He is absolutely sincere in his desire to tackle the old system, but right now, either he will drain the swamp or the old system will swallow him. And I don't want for Ukrainians to lose their hope, because Zelensky is still very much connected with their hope, and that's why they gave him this mandate. So I really want to help this young team. I want to help the president, and I think Ukraine is approaching a very critical period, and it's really a huge challenge right now. And it's the biggest, largest country in Europe. We cannot allow this country to collapse. And this is a real challenge, because if Ukraine's economy collapses as it is projected, considering what are the separatist forces, what are the destabilizing impulses from Russia, we are faced with very dangerous situation, not only for us here, but for the entire European continent. And that's why Ukraine needs very special approach, attitude, and I want to be in charge of, and President mandates me, if I'm confirmed, to be in charge of talks with the IMF and other international institutions. I have huge experience of doing that, and to do also to tackle the issue of deregulation, to decrease and change this and get rid of opportunities for corruption. When I was president of Georgia, Georgia progressed from 127th place in terms of ease of doing business to number 8 in the world. I can deliver the same thing for Ukraine. I want Ukraine to be top among the best destinations to invest and to do business with. And that would be my mandate and goal.
A few months ago, you warned that Ukraine might fall apart into 5 pieces.
No, Ukraine, that's certainly the dream of Vladimir Putin, to have not one Ukraine, but several Ukraines. Unless Ukraine reforms and tackles corruption and also cracks down on separatists in the way of rule of law, we are facing the risks, let's face it. But I think with proper, strong policy, we can definitely avoid the nightmare scenario, not only for Ukrainians, for us here, for the entire world. That's the last thing we want to see, and that we certainly are not going to allow it to happen. But we know one guy, his name is Vladimir Putin, who certainly not only dreams about it, he talks about it. He does it if he is allowed to do it to accomplish this goal.
Zelensky promised a peace in Donbass. Your relations with Russia, as it known, have been strained since your presidency in Georgia. How can you support a president who is ready to make concessions towards the Kremlin?
Well, I'm also for peace with Russia, and until now I've supported every step in terms of peace with President Zelensky, because I think that's what the Ukrainian people and any nation would want in the world. But it takes two to dance tango. We need a partner in that talks, and unfortunately we are not getting the same attitude from the Russians. Look, The fact that President Zelensky nominated me for this very high political position, the fact that it has been followed by outbursts of very dirty, hysterical propaganda on Russian official media, is saying that Zelensky knew that it would happen, but he still took the risk, which means that he feels that he's head of independent state that takes its own independent decision. It's a bad news for anyone who thought that Ukraine would be less independent and more subservient to anyone. And so, yeah, that's also a big political message to the Ukrainian people and to the outside, that Ukraine feels that they should take their own free decisions.
Were you in contact with Zelensky during his election campaign? What did you talk about? Did he promise you any high positions in the government in case of his victory?
I campaigned for Zelensky when I was exiled by previous President Poroshenko. I met lots of Ukrainian immigrants all around Europe, especially in Poland, thousands of them, and I called on them to vote for Zelensky. I never asked anything in exchange. In parliamentary campaign, I removed my party from the list and asked our voters to endorse. I endorsed Zelensky for our voters to vote for him. I never asked for anything. In fact, I've not really known him. I met him later, and we had the instant meeting of minds. And I'm deeply fascinated by this very interesting. I cannot call him a politician. He certainly is not a politician, but he's a very good president, and he has a chance to be the best president in the history of Ukraine if he delivers on those reforms. And I'm willing to help him in delivering, because in speeding them up, because that's in everybody's interests.
Did you realize what it will be in the Ukraine after COVID-19?
Ukraine is going to face very difficult challenges. Our economy is going to be to collapse by more than 7-8% of GDP. We are going to get several millions of extra unemployed, not least the people who came back from Europe, Ukrainian, so-called Azerbaijanis who are making their money in Europe. And Ukraine is not in good shape right now to cope with those challenges. That's why we need urgent changes. We need to crack down on corruption. We need to change the entire system that has existed here survived Soviet Union and existed in Ukraine for the last 30 years. Our goal is to change the entire philosophy of administration here. And without that, there is no long-term success or even survival, because this crisis is a huge challenge, but it's also an opportunity to reform. It's a huge opportunity to change.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, for more on this story, let's cross over to DW correspondent Nick Connolly in Kyiv. Nick, how does an exiled former Georgian president end up becoming the deputy prime minister in Ukraine?
Well, Pablo, this has got to be a one-off, hasn't it? I mean, just imagine a former Portuguese, say, president becoming a senior minister or a vice prime minister in Angela Merkel's government, for instance. It's just unthinkable. This seems like a story from the 18th century where European countries were bringing in monarchs from other countries to rule them. But he is really a kind of a maverick, an unusual guy for an unusual time. He is no stranger to Ukraine. He studied here back in the 80s when his home country of Georgia and Ukraine were in the same country, in the Soviet Union. He made friends with Petro Poroshenko at university, who went on to become president, as did he. He really built a reputation for himself as a disruptor, as a real liberalizer, someone who was willing to make enemies in the path of really shaking up that post-Soviet system. For instance, when faced with a corrupt police force, he just fired everyone and hired newbies whose only real qualification for lots of the time was just having nothing to do with the previous regime and the previous police. So he's someone with a lot of enemies, but also who has really built a brand around that kind of uncompromising reform, something that lots of people here in Ukraine are yearning for, concerned that Ukraine is really just muddling through and not living up to its full potential. So this is someone who also, as we mentioned before, has fallen out with his bosses here in Ukraine before. Petro Poroshenko stripped him of his passport. He broke over the border to come back in extraordinary scenes. Then he was running over the rooftops behind me. So this is someone who really thrives in a crisis.
So it's safe to say that he's not your standard politician, Nick. Why bring him into the game now?
I think there's no coincidence that this is happening now at a time of extraordinary stress through COVID-19. Millions of Ukrainians have lost their jobs. Most have savings that will only last them a month or so. Those are the forecasts. And the government simply just doesn't have the cash to pay their wages, as is happening in Western European countries, say. Added to that, the borders are shut. Millions of Ukrainians work in Western Europe and send money back to their families. Lots of them have returned. About 2 million are estimated to have returned, and they can't get back to work. Will those jobs be there for them to get when the borders reopen? We don't know. So a time of extraordinary stress. So President Zelensky, I think his real gamble now is that given he can't give people cash, he can't promise them support now, he has to sell them a dream of an improved Ukraine and real deep structural change. And that is what Saakashvili brings with his promise of reforms and his track record back in Georgia.
Well, interesting times. Nick Connolly in Kyiv, thanks for joining us.